Camping had always been one of my favorite escapes from the stress of everyday life. Just me, my friends, and the quiet of the wilderness. This time, we decided to camp deep in the woods, far away from the usual campgrounds, where we wouldn't be disturbed by other campers or the sounds of civilization. It was me, Mike, Sarah, and Jake. We'd all known each other since high school, and we'd been on countless camping trips together. This one felt different, though. There was something about the air that weekend that felt off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just an underlying unease that seemed to hum beneath the surface of the peaceful setting. We set up camp near a small clearing, surrounded by towering trees that formed a natural wall around us. The canopy above was so thick that it blocked out most of the sky, making it feel like we were in our own little world. After we got the tents up, we built a fire and settled in for the evening, swapping stories and roasting marshmallows. As night fell, the temperature dropped quickly. The fire became our lifeline to warmth as the darkness closed in around us. The woods were eerily quiet, save for the occasional crack of a branch or rustle of leaves in the distance. Normally, the sounds of the forest at night were comforting, but that night, they felt ominous. Like something was watching us. Jake was the first to mention it. "Do you guys feel like we're being watched?" he asked, his voice barely louder than a whisper. We all laughed it off at first, attributing it to the natural paranoia that comes with being out in the wilderness. But deep down, I knew exactly what he meant. There was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before, a feeling that we weren't as alone as we thought. "Come on, man," Mike said, trying to lighten the mood. "It's just your imagination. The woods can play tricks on you at night." Sarah nodded in agreement, but I could see the unease in her eyes. She felt it too. We all did. Still, we tried to push the feeling aside and focus on enjoying the night. The fire crackled and popped, and we continued talking, but the laughter came less easily, and every sound from the woods seemed to grab our attention. At one point, I thought I saw movement just beyond the tree line, a quick flash of something pale against the darkness. I squinted, trying to make out what it was, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. I didn't say anything to the others. No point in making things worse if it really was just my imagination. Hours passed, and we eventually decided to turn in for the night. We doused the fire, and the woods immediately felt darker, more oppressive. Crawling into my sleeping bag, I tried to shake the feeling of unease, but it clung to me like a cold fog. It was sometime in the middle of the night when I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. I lay there, listening to the sounds of the forest, the steady breathing of my friends in their tents, trying to figure out what had stirred me from my sleep. And then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was faint, barely audible over the breeze, but unmistakable. Tap, tap, tap. It sounded like something tapping against wood, like someone knocking on a door, but we were in the middle of the forest. There were no doors, no structures of any kind around us. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, coming from somewhere just outside the tents. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the source, but it seemed to be coming from all around us, echoing through the trees. I reached over and shook Mike awake. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. He gradually sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Hear what?" I held my breath, waiting for the tapping to continue. For a moment, there was silence, and I thought maybe I'd imagined it after all. But then, it started again, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. Mike froze, his eyes wide. "What the hell is that?" By now, Sarah and Jake were awake too, their faces pale in the dim light of the tent. We all sat there in silence, listening to the eerie tapping. None of us dared to move, afraid of what might happen if we did. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was even more unsettling than the noise itself. We waited, our breaths shallow, listening for any sign of movement outside the tents. But there was nothing, just the quiet rustling of leaves in the wind. After what felt like an eternity, Mike whispered, "Maybe it was just a branch tapping against something." "Yeah," Jake agreed, though he didn't sound convinced. "Just the wind, probably." None of us believed it, but we needed something to hold on to, something to explain the unexplainable. Eventually, we managed to drift back to sleep, though it was a restless, uneasy sleep. The next morning, we packed up camp and left earlier than we planned. None of us mentioned the tapping again, but the tension lingered. Camping with friends has always been a tradition for me. There's something about the crisp air, the crackle of the fire, and the stars shining brighter than you could ever see in the city. But this time, the trip felt different from the beginning. It was late October, and the weather had just started to turn. My friends and I decided to make one last trip before winter set in. We picked a secluded spot deep in the national forest, far from any campsites. The idea was to get away from everything, to have a weekend of peace and quiet. But in hindsight, maybe being so isolated wasn't the best idea. It was me, Eric, Lisa, and Tom. We were all seasoned campers, so the eerie feeling we had upon arriving at our spot didn't make much sense. The clearing was perfect, nestled between towering pines and surrounded by dense woods. The sun was already setting as we set up camp, the sky burning orange and purple. But despite the beauty of the place, an uneasy feeling settled over us. After setting up our tents and gathering some firewood, we settled down around the campfire. The warmth of the fire should have been comforting, but the woods around us felt too quiet, too still. The usual sounds of birds or crickets were absent, leaving only the crackling of the fire and our voices to break the silence. We tried to shake off the discomfort by telling stories, the usual mix of funny and spooky tales we always shared on trips like this. But even the stories didn't feel right. Every so often, one of us would glance over our shoulders, as if we expected to see someone or something watching us from the trees. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. The fire was dying down, and the temperature had dropped significantly. We all retreated to our tents, the sounds of the forest still strangely absent. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. But then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard a soft shuffling sound outside my tent. I froze, holding my breath. At first, I thought it was one of my friends, but the sound didn't match the weight of a person moving. It was lighter, more deliberate, like something was circling the tents. I whispered, "Eric." Lisa, Tom. But there was no response, just that faint shuffling, moving slowly around the campsite. I wanted to unzip my tent and peek outside, but something inside me screamed not to. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Suddenly, I heard Tom's voice, low and cautious. "Do you hear that?" Relief washed over me. At least I wasn't imagining it. "Yeah," I whispered back. "What is it?" "I don't know," Tom replied, his voice tight with fear. We all stayed silent, straining to listen. The shuffling continued, stopping every so often, then starting again. It was as if whatever it was knew we were aware of it, and was playing a twisted game of hide and seek. Then, out of nowhere, there was a loud snap, like a branch breaking under pressure. I jumped, my heart racing. Lisa let out a muffled gasp from her tent. We were all on edge now, waiting for whatever was out there to reveal itself. The silence that followed was deafening. The shuffling had stopped, and for a moment, I thought maybe it was over. Maybe it had just been an animal, and now it was gone. But then, I heard it a soft, guttural growl, so low that it vibrated through the ground beneath me. It wasn't any animal I'd ever heard before. I gripped my flashlight, trying to steady my shaking hand. "Should we look?" Eric finally asked, though I could tell he didn't really want an answer. "No," I said quickly. Whatever it is, we waited out. Minutes passed like hours, and eventually, the growling stopped. But none of us slept for the rest of the night. We stayed awake, listening, waiting. The feeling of being watched never left us. As soon as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we packed up. None of us said much as we dismantled the tents and doused the fire. We didn't need to. We all felt that something had been out there with us, something that didn't belong. On the hike back to the car, the woods seemed normal again. Birds were chirping, the wind rustled through the leaves, and the sun shone brightly. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we had trespassed somewhere we weren't meant to be, that something had been watching us, and that it had only let us leave because it wanted to. We've gone on camping trips since then, but we never talk about that night. Some things are better left in the past, buried deep in the woods where they belong. But every now and then, when the wind blows just right and the woods go quiet, I find myself looking over my shoulder, just in case. Camping with friends was supposed to be a fun escape. A weekend away from the city's noise, nestled in nature's serenity. We had done it plenty of times before, but that particular trip still lingers in my mind, creeping up on me in the dead of night when I'm alone. It was the trip that reminded me that nature, though beautiful, can be terrifying. It was me, Jenny, Mark, and Rachel. We drove out to a remote spot in the national forest, miles from the nearest campsite. We wanted isolation, peace, quiet, and a place to stargaze without any light pollution. We found a clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a small creek nearby. Perfect, we thought. We set up our tents, gathered wood for the fire, and spent the evening cooking hot dogs and marshmallows, laughing at old jokes, and sharing stories. As the sky darkened, the stars began to peek through, and the forest around us grew still. Actually. But we were lost in conversation, and didn't notice at first. It wasn't until much later, after the fire had burned down to embers, that the quiet became impossible to ignore. Jenny was the first to mention it. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with tension. "Hear what?" Mark replied, still poking at the dying fire with a stick. "Nothing," she said, looking around. "That's the point, it's too quiet." We all stopped talking, suddenly hyper-aware of the silence. No wind rustling the leaves, no crickets chirping, no distant hooting of owls, just an eerie, oppressive quiet. It felt as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Rachel shivered. "Maybe it's because we're so far out. There's nothing around to make noise." "Maybe," I said, though my stomach twisted with unease. I'd been camping enough to know that even in the deepest parts of the woods, there's always some sound of branch cracking, leaves crunching, animals moving about. But here, there was nothing. We decided to go to bed, hoping the unease would pass by morning. We each retreated to our tents, but sleep didn't come easily. The quiet seemed to press down on me, making the air feel thick and heavy. Every tiny sound, my breathing, the rustling of my sleeping bag, seemed amplified in the void of the forest silence. Then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it, a faint whispering, like voices carried on the wind. I froze, straining to listen. At first, I thought it might be the others talking, but the voices didn't belong to anyone I knew. They were low, indistinct, and seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I unzipped my tent just enough to peek outside. The campfire had completely died out, and the clearing was bathed in the pale light of the moon. The shadows of the trees loomed large and ominous, but nothing seemed out of place. Then, I saw it, a figure, standing just at the edge of the tree line. My heart skipped a beat. It was tall and still, almost blending in with the darkness of the trees. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the figure remained. "Mark, Jenny," I whispered as loudly as I dared. No response. I didn't dare move. The figure didn't either. It just stood there, watching. Or at least, I thought it was watching. I couldn't make out any features, just a tall, shadowy silhouette that seemed to absorb the light around it. After what felt like an eternity, the figure slowly turned and slipped back into the trees, disappearing as if it had never been there. I sat there, frozen, for what felt like hours, waiting to see if it would return. But the forest remained still, eerily quiet. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The sun was shining, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and insects. The unease from the night before seemed almost silly in the light of day. I stepped out of my tent, and the others were already up, brewing coffee over a rekindled fire. I didn't mention what I had seen or thought I had seen. I didn't want to sound crazy. But as we packed up and hiked back to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there with us that night. Something that had watched us from the shadows, something that wasn't part of the peaceful forest. We haven't camped there since. In fact, we tend to stick closer to the official campsites these days. I still love camping, but I can't forget the way the woods went silent that night, how the air felt heavy with something unexplainable. Something I never want to encounter again. Camping with friends was something we all looked forward to every year. We chose remote locations to truly disconnect, enjoying nature without the distractions of modern life. That year, we decided to camp in a place we had heard about from a few seasoned hikers, a secluded spot deep within the national forest. It wasn't on any official map, just a place people whispered about, perfect for stargazing and escaping the world. There were 5 of us: me, Sarah, Jake, Emily, and Tom. The drive took hours, followed by a grueling hike through dense woods. When we finally arrived at the clearing, the sun was beginning to set. The place was beautiful, surrounded by towering pine trees with a small stream running nearby. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and settled in for the night, feeling accomplished for finding such an isolated paradise. As darkness fell, we lit a campfire and began our usual round of ghost stories. The flames crackled, casting dancing shadows on the trees around us. Despite the eerie stories, there was a sense of comfort in the fire's warmth and the familiar company of friends. Then, something strange happened. It started with a noise, faint at first, like rustling leaves. We paused, looking around, but saw nothing. It was probably just an animal. After all, we were deep in the woods, there were bound to be creatures nearby. We brushed it off and continued talking, but the noise persisted. It wasn't just rustling anymore. It sounded like footsteps, deliberate and slow, moving around the perimeter of our camp. I glanced at Jake, who was gripping his flashlight tightly, his face pale in the firelight. Probably just a deer, Tom said, though his voice wavered. He grabbed a stick and tossed it into the woods, trying to scare off whatever was out there. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, the footsteps started again, but this time, they were closer. Much closer. Sarah stood up, her eyes scanning the darkness beyond the fire's glow. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer, just the sound of those slow, heavy steps circling us. Jake turned on his flashlight and shone it into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, but revealed nothing but more trees and underbrush. No eyes reflected back, no figure darted away. Just emptiness. "Maybe we should go check it out," Emily suggested. Though she didn't sound convinced, none of us moved. The idea of venturing into the dark woods to confront whatever was out there didn't appeal to anyone. Then, without warning, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. We sat frozen, listening intently. But there was nothing. Just the crackling of the fire and the distant trickle of the stream. "See? It's gone," Tom said, though he didn't seem relieved. We tried to shake it off, returning to our conversation, but the atmosphere had changed. The night felt heavier, darker. Every little sound made us jump. Hours passed, and eventually, one by one, we retreated to our tents. The fire had burned low, and the woods were bathed in an inky blackness that felt suffocating. I lay in my sleeping bag, wide awake, listening for anything out of the ordinary. My heart pounded with every creak and groan of the trees. Just as I was starting to doze off, I heard it again, the footsteps, this time right outside my tent. My breath caught in my throat as I lay perfectly still, straining to hear. The steps were slow, deliberate, almost like someone was pacing around the tent. I couldn't bring myself to move, paralyzed by fear. The footsteps continued, circling my tent, then moving toward the others. I wanted to call out to my friends, but something in the back of my mind told me to stay silent. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps stopped. I held my breath, waiting, but there was nothing. The forest was silent again. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I crawled out of my tent, exhausted but relieved. The others were already awake, gathered around the remains of the fire, their faces pale and drawn. No one said anything at first, but it was clear we had all heard the same thing. "Let's back up," Jake finally said, breaking the silence. No one argued. As we hiked back to the car, none of us spoke about the night before. The eerie feeling stayed with me, though, even now, I can't explain what happened that night. We didn't see anything, but we all felt it, something watching us, circling us in the dark. We haven't been back to that spot since. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods, I still hear those footsteps, slow and deliberate, just beyond the edge of the trees. And I can't shake the feeling that whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting. Camping has always been a ritual for me and my friends. Every summer, we pick a new spot, far from the usual campgrounds and deep into the wild, where we can be surrounded by nature and free from distractions. This year, we decided to go even further off the grid than ever before, choosing an isolated location in a dense forest that a fellow camper had recommended to Tom, my best friend. There were 4 of us this time: me, Tom, Sarah, and Jake. We left the city behind in the early morning, the excitement bubbling up as we drove further into the unknown. The final stretch of our journey was on a narrow dirt road, barely visible through the overgrowth, which led us deep into the woods. By the time we arrived, the sun was already dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows through the towering trees. The place felt and touched, almost ancient, like it had existed in its quiet solitude for centuries. We set up camp near a small, crystal-clear lake. The water was so still that it perfectly reflected the surrounding trees, making the place feel surreal. As night began to fall, we gathered around the fire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories like we always did. The crackling of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl were the only sounds around us. But then, after a while, we started hearing something else. It was faint at first, a distant rustling in the bushes. I assumed it was just a small animal and didn't pay much attention. Did you hear that? Sarah suddenly asked, her voice cutting through our laughter. We all stopped talking and listened. The rustling grew louder, this time more deliberate. It didn't sound like an animal anymore. Jake grabbed a flashlight and pointed it towards the sound, but all we could see were the dense trees. Probably just a deer or something, Tom said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. We tried to brush it off, returning to our conversations, but the atmosphere had shifted. The footsteps continued, moving slowly around our camp, always just out of sight. We couldn't see anything, but we could feel that something was out there, watching us. After about an hour, the footsteps stopped. We all breathed a sigh of relief, convincing ourselves that whatever it was had left. But the uneasy feeling lingered. That night, as we settled into our tents, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. The forest, once peaceful, now felt oppressive. Every sound, the rustling of the wind, the creaking of the trees, seemed amplified in the darkness. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a soft noise, like someone whispering. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to hear. The whispering was faint but distinct, like it was coming from just outside my tent. I held my breath, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't any of my friends. The words were unintelligible, but they were there, circling my tent. I wanted to call out to the others, but fear held me back. What if whatever was out there heard me? I stayed silent, frozen in place, listening to the whispers as they moved around our campsite. They didn't sound threatening, but they didn't belong. They were wrong and natural. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was overwhelming. I waited for what felt like hours, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no voices, just the distant chirping of crickets. The next morning, we all emerged from our tents, tired and on edge. No one said anything at first, but it was clear that none of us had slept well. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. Did anyone else hear whispers? She asked hesitantly. We all looked at each other, realizing that we had each experienced the same thing. We quickly packed up our camp, eager to leave that place behind. The drive back to civilization was quiet, the usual post-camping banter replaced by an easy silence. Even now, weeks later, I can't explain what happened that night. We didn't see anything, but we all heard it, the footsteps, the whispers. It felt like the forest itself was alive, watching us, testing us. I haven't been able to shake the feeling that we weren't supposed to be there, that something ancient and unseen was warning us to leave. We all survived that camping trip, but the experience changed us. None of us have mentioned going back, and I've found myself hesitating to venture too far into the wilderness since then. There are things out there, things we can't see or explain, and sometimes they remind us that we are only visitors in their world. Camping had always been my favorite way to escape the city's noise. There's something about the isolation, the simplicity, and the raw connection to nature that draws me in. This time, though, something felt different. The forest was eerily quiet, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. It was just me and three of my closest friends, Tom, Claire, and Jake. We'd chosen a spot deep in the woods, miles away from any sign of civilization. No cell service, no roads nearby, just us and the wilderness. It was perfect, or so we thought. We arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon, the sun beginning to dip behind the trees. The forest was thick, and the shadows stretched long, creating strange shapes on the ground. We pitched our tents, gathered firewood, and settled in for what we assumed would be a relaxing weekend. As night fell, we gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. The warmth of the fire was comforting against the cool night air, and the flickering flames cast dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. The forest was alive with the sounds of crickets, rustling leaves, and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, but then, around midnight, something changed. The forest fell silent. The usual symphony of nighttime sounds abruptly stopped, leaving an unnatural stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. We all noticed it, exchanging uneasy glances around the fire. "Did you hear that?" Claire whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire. I strained to listen, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. Then, I heard it soft, almost imperceptible, but definitely there. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and coming from somewhere in the darkness beyond the FIRELIGHT. Jake grabbed the flashlight and aimed it towards the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. just trees and shadows. Yet, the footsteps continued, circling us, always just out of sight. Probably just an animal, Tom said, trying to sound casual, but his voice was tight with tension. We tried to brush it off, but the mood had shifted. The once cozy campfire now felt like a fragile barrier between us and whatever was out there. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Eventually, the footsteps faded, and the forest slowly came back to life with its usual nighttime noises. We all breathed a little easier, but the tension remained. No one said it, but we were all on edge. We decided to call it a night and retreated to our tents. I lay there, staring at the roof of my tent, unable to sleep. Every little sound outside made me jump. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind or an animal, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to a strange noise. It wasn't the footsteps this time, but something else, a low, guttural growl. It was faint, but unmistakable, and it was coming from right outside my tent. My heart pounded in my chest as I listened, paralyzed with fear. I didn't dare move or make a sound. The growling continued, slow and deliberate, like something was just waiting for me to make a mistake. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it would go away. After what felt like an eternity, the growling finally stopped, and the forest fell silent once more. The next morning, we all emerged from our tents, looking worse for wear. No one had slept well, and it was clear that we had all heard something during the night. We packed up our camp in record time, eager to leave that place behind. As we hiked back to the car, none of us said much. The usually lively banter was replaced by an easy silence. It wasn't until we were safely back in the car, driving away from the forest, that Jake finally spoke. "You guys heard it too, right?" he asked, his voice tense. We all nodded. No one needed to elaborate. We had all experienced something out there, something that we couldn't explain. And none of us were eager to stick around and find out what it was. That camping trip changed us. We used to love the isolation, the thrill of being deep in the wilderness. But after that night, we all agreed that maybe some places were better left untouched. There's a darkness in the woods, an ancient presence that we're not meant to disturb. And sometimes, it reminds us just how small and vulnerable we really are. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend just for friends camping in the deep woods, away from the noise of everyday life. We'd done this before, but this time, the remoteness of our chosen spot felt different, more isolated. And now, looking back, I realized that feeling wasn't just in my head. We arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon. The sun was already beginning to sink behind the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The spot we chose was perfect, nestled between towering pines and not another soul for miles. No cell service, no people, just us and nature. It was exactly what we wanted, or so we thought. As the evening settled in, we set up camp, built a fire, and cooked dinner. The conversation flowed easily as we laughed and reminisced about old stories. The forest around us was alive with sounds, the chirping of crickets, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the distant call of an owl. It was peaceful, but as the night wore on, something in the air changed. It started around midnight. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the night had grown darker, thicker, as if the forest itself was closing in on us. The usual sounds of the woods had fallen eerily silent. We all noticed it, exchanging uneasy glances across the campfire. "Is it just me, or did it get really quiet all of a sudden?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking the stillness. "It's just the woods," Mark replied, trying to sound confident, though I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "Sometimes it gets quiet like this," but I wasn't so sure. There was something about the silence that felt wrong, oppressive, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then we heard it. A faint rustling in the trees, just beyond the reach of our firelight. It wasn't the sound of wind through the leaves or an animal scurrying through the underbrush. It was something deliberate, something or someone moving through the darkness. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it toward the sound. The beam cut through the night, but revealed nothing, just trees and shadows. The rustling stopped, and for a moment, everything was still again. "Probably just a deer," Tom said, though his voice was tight with tension. "We're in their territory, after all." We tried to laugh it off, but the atmosphere had changed. The once cozy campfire now felt like our only barrier against the unknown darkness that surrounded us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We decided to call it a night, but sleep didn't come easily. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling of my tent, listening for any sound, any sign that whatever was out there had moved on. But the forest remained unnervingly silent. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange noise. A low, rhythmic thumping sound, almost like footsteps, but too slow and heavy to belong to any animal I could think of. My heart raced as I listened, the sound growing closer, louder, until it was right outside my tent. I held my breath, frozen with fear. The thumping stopped, replaced by the unmistakable sound of breathing. Deep, raspy breaths, as if something or someone was standing right outside, just inches away from where I lay. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it to go away, praying that I was just imagining things. After what felt like an eternity, the breathing stopped, and the night returned to its oppressive silence. I didn't move. I didn't dare. The next morning, we all emerged from our tents, looking worse for wear. None of us had slept well, and it was clear that I wasn't the only one who had heard something during the night. Sarah's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Did anyone else hear breathing?" she asked quietly. We all nodded, and an uneasy silence fell over the group. No one wanted to admit it, but we all knew that something had been out there with us. Something that wasn't just a deer or a passing animal. We packed up camp quickly, eager to leave the woods behind. As we hiked back to the car, none of us said much. The usual light-hearted banter was replaced by tense, nervous silence. It wasn't until we were safely back in the car, driving away from the forest, that we finally let out a collective sigh of relief. We never talked about that night again, but it stayed with us, a lingering shadow in the back of our minds. Camping trips lost their appeal after that. The woods, once a place of peace and solitude, had shown us a darker side, one that we were in no hurry to revisit. To this day, I still can't explain what happened that night. But I know one thing for sure, we weren't alone out there. And whatever it was, it's better left undiscovered. Camping trips had always been my way of escaping the hustle of daily life. The fresh air, the scent of pine, the crackle of a fire under a blanket of stars, it was my sanctuary. So, when my two best friends, Jake and Emily, suggested a weekend in the woods, I jumped at the chance. We found a spot deep in the forest, away from the usual campgrounds, a place where we could truly disconnect. We arrived late afternoon, the sun sinking low behind the trees, casting long, slanted shadows across the forest floor. The air was cool and crisp, with the familiar earthy smell of the woods welcoming us. We set up our tents, gathered some firewood, and soon had a fire roaring. As night fell, we settled around the fire, the warmth and the dancing flames comforting against the growing chill in the air. We roasted marshmallows, laughed, and shared stories. The usual sounds of the forest, the chirping of crickets, the distant call of an owl surrounded us, creating a peaceful backdrop. But as the night wore on, that peace started to unravel. It began with the silence. Not a gradual quieting, but a sudden, suffocating silence that swallowed up the sounds of the night. The crickets stopped chirping, they all fell silent, and even the wind seemed to die down. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. "Do you guys hear that?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hear what?" Jake responded, but I could tell he felt it too. The absence of sound was unnerving. "I don't know. It's too quiet," Emily said, glancing around, her eyes reflecting the flickering firelight. I nodded in agreement, a tight knot of unease forming in my stomach. I tried to shake it off. After all, we were deep in the woods, far from any human activity. Of course, it would be quiet, but this was different. It felt like we weren't alone, like something was watching us from the shadows just beyond the reach of our firelight. Suddenly, there was a sound. A faint rustling, like leaves being disturbed by something, or someone. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it in the direction of the noise, but all I could see were the trees and the darkness between them. "Probably just an animal," Jake said, though his voice lacked confidence. We all knew that whatever made that sound wasn't just a deer or a raccoon. The tension around the campfire grew palpable. The rustling came again, this time closer. I turned the flashlight toward the noise once more, but there was nothing, just the oppressive darkness of the woods. My heart raced, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "Let's just go to bed," I suggested, trying to keep my voice steady. The others agreed. Too uneasy to argue, we crawled into our tents, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of a branch, every whisper of wind had me on edge. I lay there, listening, straining to hear anything beyond the rustle of nylon and the soft breathing of my friends. It was sometime in the dead of night when I woke up to a noise that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't the wind or the sound of an animal in the underbrush. It was footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, circling our campsite. My breath caught in my throat as I listened, too terrified to move. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they seemed to be right outside my tent. Then, they stopped. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. For what felt like an eternity, everything was silent again. I wanted to call out to Jake and Emily, but fear kept me frozen in place. Just as I started to convince myself that I was imagining things, I heard it, a low, guttural breathing, just outside my tent. The kind of breathing that didn't belong to any animal I knew. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but there was no rational explanation for what I was hearing. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the breathing stopped. The footsteps resumed, but this time, they were moving away, fading into the distance until there was nothing but silence once more. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When morning finally came, we all emerged from our tents, our faces pale and drawn. No one spoke at first, but I could see the same fear in Jake's and Emily's eyes that I had felt all night. Did anyone else hear footsteps? Emily finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. We all nodded, exchanging uneasy glances. No one wanted to admit it, but we all knew that something or someone had been out there with us. We packed up quickly, not wanting to stay another minute in that place. As we hiked back to the car, the forest seemed different, less welcoming, more sinister. The trees that had once felt like a protective barrier now seemed like they were hiding something, something that had been watching us all night. We never spoke about that night again, but the memory lingers, a shadow in the back of my mind. I haven't been camping since, and I doubt I ever will again. Some places are meant to be left alone, and I'm certain. I've always loved camping, getting away from the chaos of the city, immersing myself in nature, and just enjoying the peace and quiet. So, when my friends suggested a camping trip deep in the woods one weekend, I couldn't say no. We picked a spot far from the main trails, away from any other campers. It was secluded, just the way we liked it. The first day was perfect. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and spent the afternoon hiking through the woods. The sun filtered through the trees, casting a warm golden light over everything. By evening, we were sitting around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. As night fell, the temperature dropped, and the forest seemed to close in around us. The fire crackled and popped, but beyond that, the woods were eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. It was the kind of quiet that felt unnatural. Do you hear that, Jess? One of my friends suddenly asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was low, cautious. Hear what? I asked, leaning forward. That's the problem, she replied. I don't hear anything. We all paused, listening. She was right. The usual sounds of the forest at night, the insects, the breeze, the distant calls of nocturnal animals were gone. The silence felt heavy, oppressive. It's just a quiet night, Mark said, trying to brush it off. Maybe the animals are sleeping, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept glancing into the woods, half expecting to see something lurking just beyond the firight. As the night wore on, the tension grew. We tried to keep up the conversation, but it was forced. Every so often, one of us would stop mid-sentence, thinking we'd heard something, a twig snapping, a faint rustle in the underbrush, but whenever we turned to look, there was nothing. I think I'm going to head to bed, Jess said eventually, her voice tight. It's been a long day. We all agreed, extinguishing the fire and retreating to our tents. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay there, wide awake, listening. The silence pressed in on me, amplifying every tiny sound. Then, just as I started to drift off, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. It wasn't loud, but in the stillness of the night, it seemed to echo through the trees. I froze, straining to hear more. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from just outside my tent. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a branch knocking against something, or an animal scurrying around, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The taps were too deliberate, too precise. Tap, tap, tap. I held my breath, willing it to stop, but it didn't. Instead, it grew louder, closer. Whatever it was right outside now. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping it would just go away, that I was imagining things. But then, there was a sound that sent a chill down my spine, a slow, deliberate dragging sound, Like something heavy being pulled through the dirt, I mustered the courage to unzip my tent just a crack, peering out into the darkness. The fire had long since died out, leaving only the faint glow of the moon to illuminate the clearing. I saw nothing, just shadows and trees, but the sound continued. Drag, tap, drag, tap. My breath caught as I noticed something at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the moonlight. A figure, tall and thin, stood motionless between the trees. Its form was vague, like a shadow come to life, but there was no mistaking the unnerving presence it carried. I shut the tent flap quickly, retreating back into the thin safety of nylon. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I wanted to wake Jess and Mark, but I was too terrified to move. For what felt like hours, I lay there, listening. The tapping had stopped, but the silence was worse. My imagination ran wild, picturing that shadowy figure standing just outside, waiting. Eventually, exhaustion must have taken over, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. Sunlight filtered through the trees, and the forest was alive again with the sounds of birds and insects. I cautiously unzipped my tent, half expecting to see signs of whatever had been out there, but everything looked normal. Jess and Mark emerged from their tents, both looking as tired and shaken as I felt. We didn't speak much as we packed up camp. I didn't mention what I'd seen or thought I'd seen, and neither did they, but I could tell they had felt it too. The unspoken tension hung in the air as we hiked back to the car. We never talked about that night again, but I know we all remember it. That feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond our sight. I haven't been camping since, and I don't think I ever will again. Camping trips were supposed to be fun, an escape from the monotony of daily life. That's why I agreed to join my friends in the middle of nowhere for a weekend in the woods. The drive out was long, winding through dense forests and past forgotten small towns. By the time we reached our spot, we were miles away from civilization, just us, the trees, and the night. The first day was perfect. We set up our tents, gathered wood for the fire, and spent the afternoon hiking. The sun was shining, the air was crisp, and there wasn't another soul in sight. It felt like we had the entire forest to ourselves. By nightfall, we were gathered around the campfire, laughing and sharing stories. The fire crackled and popped, sending embers up into the darkening sky. I leaned back, letting the warmth of the flames chase away the evening chill. Ever hear about the Wendigo? Alex asked, his voice low and ominous. Come on, man, don't start with that stuff, Sarah groaned. She hated ghost stories, but that never stopped Alex. It's not a ghost story, Alex insisted. It's a legend, a real one. Supposedly, there are spirits in these woods, ancient, malevolent things that possess people who get too greedy or too desperate. They turn them into these monstrous, cannibalistic creatures. Nice try, Alex, I said, chuckling. But I'm not buying it. Look, all I'm saying is, strange things happen in places like this. You think you're alone out here, but you're not. There's always something watching. A sudden gust of wind blew through the trees, making the fire flicker. The laughter died down, and we all glanced around uneasily. The forest had gone quiet, no chirping insects, no rustling leaves, just an unsettling stillness. Probably just the wind, I muttered, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. But as the night dragged on, that stillness remained. We all went to bed a little earlier than planned, the fun of the night soured by an inexplicable tension in the air. I lay in my tent, wide awake, listening to the eerie silence outside. Every rustle, every creak, made my heart pound. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off to sleep. I woke up to the sound of something scraping against the side of my tent. My eyes snapped open, and I held my breath, straining to hear. The scraping continued slow, deliberate, like something was dragging a sharp object along the fabric. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I reached for my flashlight, fumbling with the switch before finally turning it on. The tent was bathed in a weak, yellow glow, but there was nothing inside. Just me and my sleeping bag. The scraping stopped. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the sound to come back, but it didn't. Maybe it was an animal, I told myself. Just a raccoon or a branch blowing in the wind. I lay back down, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent and found Sarah and Alex already up, looking just as tired as I felt. Did you guys hear anything last night? I asked, hoping I wasn't the only one. Sarah nodded, her face pale. Something was walking around my tent. I thought I was just imagining it, but now I'm not so sure. Alex looked uneasy. Same here. Something wasn't right out there. We all exchanged uneasy glances, but none of us wanted to be the first to admit we were scared. After a quick breakfast, we decided to cut the trip short and head back home. The fun we had planned for the weekend wasn't worth the creeping dread that had settled over us. As we packed up camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I turned around, I expected to see something lurking in the trees, something with hollow eyes and sharp claws, just waiting for us to let our guard down. We left the campsite in record time, the silence of the forest pressing down on us the entire way. The drive back felt longer than usual, and none of us spoke much. The unease lingered even as the trees thinned and we re-entered civilization. It's been months since that trip, and I still can't explain what happened. Maybe it was just our imaginations running wild, or maybe there really is something out there in the woods, something ancient and hungry, just like Alex said. All I know is I haven't been camping since. I remember the night vividly. It was late summer, and my friends and I decided to camp in the woods near the old lake. We had heard it was a popular spot for fishing and had been looking forward to a quiet weekend away from city life. We arrived early in the afternoon, set up our tents, and spent the day fishing and swimming. The sun was setting as we started a campfire and began cooking dinner. As the flames danced and the smell of grilled food filled the air, we all joked and laughed, savoring the simplicity of the moment. When darkness fell, we gathered around the fire, the shadows of the trees stretching long and thin in the flickering light. Someone brought up local legends about a ghostly figure that roamed these woods, a tale meant to spook us, but we all dismissed it with laughs and shushing. As the fire began to die down, I decided to walk down to the edge of the lake. The water was still, reflecting the stars above like a dark, mirror-like sheet. I felt a shiver of unease, but I chalked it up to the cooling night air. Standing there, I noticed something odd. A faint, rhythmic tapping sound, like someone tapping a stick against a tree, was coming from deeper in the woods. I tried to ignore it, but the sound grew louder and closer, like footsteps crunching on dry leaves. I called out to my friends, but the only response was the echo of my own voice. Curiosity got the better of me. I moved towards the sound, the flashlight in my hand casting eerie shadows on the trees. The tapping persisted, seemingly coming from all directions. I began to feel like I was being watched, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I reached a clearing and spotted something unusual: old, decayed picnic tables with broken benches and a rusty, overturned grill. It looked abandoned and out of place. The tapping stopped abruptly. I scanned the area with my flashlight but saw nothing. A strange feeling of dread washed over me, so I turned and headed back to camp. As I walked back, I noticed that the sound had stopped completely. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was following me. My flashlight's beam caught a flicker of movement in the trees, but every time I looked directly, there was nothing there. When I reached the camp, I tried to act nonchalant, but my friends noticed my pale face and shaking hands. I told them about the tapping and the odd picnic area. They laughed it off, attributing it to the wild imagination fueled by ghost stories. Still, the mood around the campfire had shifted slightly. With uneasy glances exchanged, we decided to call it a night and retreated to our tents. I lay in my sleeping bag, trying to shake off the lingering fear. Sleep didn't come easily, and every creak and rustle outside my tent made me jump. At some point in the night, I heard a louder noise, a distinct, deliberate thump that shook my tent. My heart raced, and I lay still, listening. The thumping continued, then stopped abruptly. I held my breath, straining to hear any other sounds, but only silence followed. Morning came, and with it, a sense of relief. We packed up quickly, the experience of the previous night making everyone eager to leave. As we drove away, I glanced back at the woods, trying to see if there was anything out of place, but all I saw was the familiar landscape. Even now, I'm not sure what I heard that night. The tapping, the thumping, it was unsettling, but nothing dangerous ever happened. My friends and I agreed it was probably just the wind or some animals, but the eerie feeling lingered long after we left. I haven't camped in those woods since, and I doubt I ever will. The memory of that night remains with me, a chilling reminder that sometimes, the scariest things are the ones we can't quite explain. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway. My friends and I had rented a small cabin near the edge of the national park, a place we'd chosen for its seclusion and beautiful, wooded landscape. As we arrived on a Friday evening, the sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the surrounding trees. We set up our gear and settled in, looking forward to 2 days of hiking and campfire stories. That night, we sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and reminiscing about old times. It was peaceful and serene, with the crackling fire and the occasional hoot of an owl breaking the silence. Around midnight, we decided to turn in. As I was heading to my tent, I noticed the forest had grown unusually quiet. No chirping crickets or rustling leaves, just stillness. I dismissed it as the quiet of nightfall and went to sleep. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my tent. At first, I thought it was one of my friends moving around. But the footsteps were too irregular, and there was an unsettling quality to them, like they were getting closer, then retreating, then coming closer again. My heart began to race. I unzipped my tent cautiously and peered outside with my flashlight, but saw nothing. The area around the cabin was eerily empty, bathed in moonlight. I tried to convince myself it was an animal or just the wind playing tricks. I went back to sleep, albeit fitfully. The next morning, I mentioned the footsteps to my friends. They laughed it off as raccoons or deer. We spent the day hiking and exploring, trying to shake off the eerie feeling from the night before. That evening, we gathered for dinner and talked about our plans for the next day. As the sun set, the forest grew dark again, and the unsettling quiet returned. We were sitting around the campfire when I heard it again, the footsteps. This time, they seemed closer, more deliberate. I looked around, but no one else seemed to notice. I tried to ignore it, but the sound continued, coming from various directions, like someone was walking around the camp, but never quite coming into view. My friends started to sense something was off when I couldn't stop glancing into the trees. They teased me, but their voices lacked the usual confidence. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night, and I made sure to zip my tent tightly. A few hours later, I woke up again to the footsteps. They were louder this time, almost as if someone was walking right outside my tent. My flashlight was within reach, so I grabbed it and shone it through the mesh window. I saw nothing but the dark outline of the trees swaying gently in the breeze. I hesitated, but then I heard something more disturbing, a whispering, as if someone was right next to me, murmuring unintelligible words. I bolted upright, heart pounding, and shone my flashlight outside. The whispering stopped abruptly, and again, I saw nothing. At daybreak, I told my friends what had happened. This time, they took me seriously. We decided to check the perimeter of the cabin and found nothing unusual. No footprints or disturbances, just the same peaceful forest as before. We spent the rest of the day exploring and enjoying ourselves, but the strange occurrences lingered in the back of our minds. The next night, as we sat around the campfire, someone suggested we make a game of it, pretending to be spooked by the sounds. It was meant to lighten the mood, and we laughed and joked. But the footsteps did not return. By the time we packed up and left the cabin the next morning, we were all relieved. We joked about our ghostly visitor and agreed it must have been our imagination, or perhaps a combination of wind and shadows. To this day, I don't know what those footsteps were or if they were a figment of my imagination. But every time I hear an unexplained noise at night, I think back to that weekend. It was a scary experience, but nothing truly dangerous happened. We all survived unscathed, and the memory of those footsteps remains a chilling, yet harmless, mystery.